The security camera at Inokashira Zoo recorded it sometime after midnight. A shape moving through a gap in the fence low to the ground, unhurried crossing the open concrete of the outdoor enclosure toward a small wire crate sitting under a heating lamp in the far corner. Inside the crate, a macaque, 8 months old, not once touched by another of her kind. The shape settled against the side of the crate and did not move. When the keeper arrived at 6 in the morning, the camera feed showed a small macaque sleeping against the inner surface of the mesh and a tanuki sleeping against the outer surface separated by a few millimeters of wire, both of them still. He stood in the enclosure entrance for a long time without moving. For 3 weeks, he had watched her press one hand against the mesh each morning and hold it there waiting for something on the other side to notice, and nothing ever did. He had not expected this. Nobody had. 3 weeks earlier, there had been nothing to expect. The zoo opens at 9:30, but the macaque troop has been awake since before 6. By the time the first keeper arrives, the 14 animals have already completed the slow daily negotiation that governs every hour of their lives. Who feeds first? Who sits closest to the heated water feature? Who presses into the center of the morning huddle and who settles for the outside edge? The older females move to the warmest concrete first. The juveniles follow. The lower-ranking adults arrange themselves around what remains. And the whole shuffle will repeat itself at every meal, every rest period, every cold hour between now and dark. It is the same system every morning. At the far end of the enclosure, in a wire crate set against the back fence, Yuki sits and watches the troop the way she watches it every morning. Nothing about her posture has changed in 3 weeks. She is 8 months old, and her coat has come in thick and even brown, at the tips dense at the roots, fuller now, with the approach of winter. Her eyes track the troop's movements. She eats what the keepers bring her mostly. On paper, she is doing adequately. Not one animal in the enclosure has looked toward her crate this morning. Not one has looked toward it in 3 weeks. Her mother, Hana, is 7 years old and was carrying her first pregnancy when Yuki was born in early March. First-time macaque mothers in captivity sometimes do not have the knowledge they need, not because something is wrong with them, but because that knowledge normally passes through observation, through years spent watching older females in the troop raise their own young. Hana had not had that. When Yuki arrived, Hana looked at her and did not know what to do. By the following morning, the decision had been made. The keepers would raise her. 8 months of formula of careful feeding schedules, of the particular slow attentiveness that the staff at Inokashira give to every hand-raised animal in their care. Yuki learned to eat solid food to climb, to make the ascending contact call that macaques use to find each other across a distance. She learned the physical vocabulary of her species. What she did not learn, what no keeper can teach, however patient, is the social grammar that determines whether another macaque will accept her or not, the precise angle of approach that signals deference, the specific posture that invites grooming, the half-second of stillness that means I am not a threat before 2 animals decide to sit together. Yuki had grown up without any of it. The reintroduction had begun at 6 months. The standard graduated process, her crate moved progressively closer to the troop, then placed inside the enclosure itself, so the animals could smell her, observe her, make their own assessment. The troop did assess her. They looked at her crate, registered its contents, and moved on. Not one animal returned to investigate further. Not one female paused near the mesh, the way females sometimes do when they are considering an unfamiliar young animal. The troop went about its days, and Yuki's crate was simply something in the enclosure present unacknowledged, like the fence posts and the feeding platforms. Japanese macaques are not solitary animals. Their immune function, their stress hormone regulation, their ability to hold body temperature through a cold night, all depend on proximity to others of their kind. A macaque outside a troop is a body running processes that require more than one animal to complete. Keeper Suzuki Ren was 26 years old and 4 months into his first full-time position. He had spent 2 years before that doing volunteer rehabilitation work, and he had not yet learned which observations to stop making. He had been noting Yuki's food intake since the second week of the reintroduction, down nearly a third from where it had started and still declining. He had noted when she stopped engaging with the puzzle feeders, when she stopped pulling at the rope segments the enrichment team left in her crate. He had noted that she had developed a habit each morning of pressing the flat of one hand against the mesh panel nearest the troop, holding it there for several minutes before the troop began to move, and then withdrawing it. He did not know what to make of it. He kept the record anyway. On day 21, he brought the file to Dr. Ishida Naomi. She was the senior veterinarian on the unit, 44 years old, 15 years in zoo medicine, with the particular directness of someone who has learned that vague language costs more time than it saves. She looked through the data without comment. Then she said that Yuki was not ill in any way she could treat. She said that the trajectory, if it continued, would become a clinical problem within the week. She said she wanted to review again in 4 days and that she was not expecting improvement. Ren walked back to the enclosure and stood outside the crate. Yuki was sitting at the mesh, one hand pressed flat against it, watching the troop move through their morning routine without a pause in her direction. 4 meters away, on the other side of a chain-link fence that had been flagged for maintenance the previous April, the tanuki enclosure held one animal. Bunta was 6 years old, stocky and dark-furred with the black eye mask that gives his species their common name and the low-slung, rounded silhouette of an animal built for moving close to the ground. He had come to Inokashira 4 years ago, a young adult who had been struck by a vehicle on a road outside the park and whose injuries made release impossible. His enclosure was shaded by a stand of camellia that dropped pink flowers onto the concrete each spring. He had shared it until 14 months ago with a female named Cage. Tanuki are the only canid species that hibernate. In the weeks before the cold sets in, they build fat reserves that can reach half their body weight, then enter a state of reduced metabolic activity that carries them through the months when food is scarce. They do this in pairs. The proximity of a partner during torpor is not incidental comfort, it is a physiological requirement. The shared body heat that regulates the process and prevents the metabolism from dropping past the point of recovery. A tanuki entering winter torpor alone is a body attempting a function it was not designed to perform without assistance. Kage had died in September of the previous year, a cardiac event sudden. Bunta had entered that first winter alone and come through March 31% lighter than he had gone, and his reserves depleted, past the point the keepers had expected to find him intact. He had spent the following summer eating, but the numbers through October were running behind his fat accumulation slower than it had been in any previous year, not enough to carry a second winter of the same kind. Tanaka Hiroshi, the unit supervisor, had added 2 words to Bunta's November file. Monitor closely. On the evening of November 6th, the temperature dropped to 2 degrees Celsius. The macaque troop moved inside, pressing into the heated section of the enclosure in the shifting arrangement that cold nights always produce the highest-ranking females at the center. The others layered outward warmth distributed by the same hierarchy that distributed everything else. Yuki's crate was in the outdoor section near the fence. She had the heating lamp the keepers had positioned above it. She had the fleece folded at the bottom. She sat against the mesh as the enclosure emptied, and the outdoor section went quiet, and the lamp threw a pale circle of warmth onto the concrete around her crate, and beyond it, the night was dark and still. The section of fence between the macaque enclosure and the tanuki habitat had been on the maintenance list since April. A stretch of chain link along the lower left corner where rust had weakened the attachment points. In the ordinary run of things, it would have been replaced in summer. The summer had been short-staffed, the autumn had been busy in different ways, and the item remained on the list. On the night of November 6th, the weakened section pulled free of its anchor points without sound. No alarm, no impact, just metal giving way to the slow pressure of time and rust. The gap left in the lower corner was wide enough. Bunta moves at night by smell. His eyesight is poor, which matters less in darkness than it might. And his nose compensates for most of what his eyes cannot do. He had been resting in the inner section of his enclosure through the early evening, and sometime after midnight, he began to move the slow, low-to-the-ground patrol that tanuki make through their territory in the dark hours. The wind that night ran from the macaque enclosure toward the tanuki habitat. It carried the warm compound smell of 14 sleeping animals, and underneath it, distinct enough that his nose separated it from the rest, something smaller. Something that was not sleeping in a group. Something alone. The security camera on the east wall of the macaque enclosure recorded a shape moving through the gap in the fence. Low to the ground. Slow. The shape crossed the open concrete of the outdoor section and moved toward the far corner, where a small crate sat under a heating lamp. The troop did not stir. 14 macaques slept through the arrival of a canid in their enclosure, because Bunta made no sound and moved without urgency and smelled of nothing that the sleeping animals registered as requiring response. He reached the crate and stopped. He lowered his nose to the gap at the bottom of the mesh and breathed in for a long time. Then he sat back on his haunches. Then he lay down against the side of the crate, his broad back settling against the wire, his chin coming to rest on his paws. Inside the crate, Yuki woke. She had been curled in the corner of her fleece, and the smell reached her before any sound did something dense, an animal, and entirely outside anything her 8 months had prepared her for. She pressed herself to the back of the crate and sat very still, watching the shape outside the mesh. Bunta did not turn his head toward her. He lay with his eyes forward and breathed. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Yuki's shoulders came down a degree. Her grip on the fleece loosened. After half an hour, she moved one careful step toward the mesh panel nearest where he lay. Then another and pressed her nose against the wire. Bunta did not move. Neither of them moved again before morning. Suzuki Ren arrived at 6 in the morning, as he always did, to check on Yuki before the troop came outside. He saw Bunta first. He stood in the enclosure entrance and looked at the tanuki lying against the crate, and then he looked at Yuki. And then he stood very still for a moment. Very still for a year. Yuki was not in her corner. She was lying on her side against the mesh, one arm extended the back of her hand, resting against the wire. Her posture was loose in a way he had not seen since the reintroduction began. He called Tanaka. Tanaka arrived without tea, which Ren registered because in 4 months he had not once seen the man appear at anything without it. They stood outside the crate and looked. Bunta had woken when he heard the gate open and was sitting upright now, watching them with the calm attention of an animal that is not alarmed but is waiting to understand what is expected. Yuki slept on. Tanaka looked at the gap in the fence, then at Bunta, then told Ren they needed to get the fence closed before the troop came out. Then he said he needed a few minutes. They stood at the enclosure fence for a long time, talking quietly. Tanaka laid out what he knew. Bunta was a canid 6 kilograms, with the instincts of a predator that 4 years of zoo residency had not removed. There was no protocol for this situation. There was no precedent he was aware of. Last night had produced no incident, and last night also could not guarantee anything about tonight. Ren said that Yuki's intake numbers were at the point where Ishida had said she expected clinical decline. He said the camera had recorded 4 hours of a tanuki lying against a crate without incident. He said he did not have an argument, only those 2 things. Tanaka looked at Yuki sleeping against the mesh with her hand against the wire. He told Ren to open the crate and said he would stay. Ren lifted the latch and stepped back. He did not reach inside. He did not make any movement toward Yuki. He left the door open and waited. Bunta heard the latch. He shifted his weight, turned slightly toward the open door, and then lay back down in the same position, beside the crate, head on paws, making no move toward the opening. Yuki woke when the morning light changed. She sat up, looked at the open door, looked at the space beyond it, and looked at the large, dark shape lying a few feet away in that space. 7 minutes passed. Then she stepped out. The concrete was colder than the floor of her crate, and she felt it immediately. Her weight shifting as she adjusted, but she did not step back. She stood in the doorway and looked at Bunta. Bunta lay with his head on his paws and breathed. She took 1 step toward him, then another. Then she was close enough that she could have touched the nearest edge of his winter coat, and she stopped and pressed her nose forward and inhaled for a long time. Then she reached out one hand and touched the fur on his flank. Drew back. Touched it again this time, pressing her fingers in toward the dense underlayer. Bunta did not move. Yuki began to groom him, working through his coat with the small, careful searching movements that macaques use, the only social language she had ever known how to speak. She had been offering it her whole life, with no one to receive it. Bunta sat under her hands and did not move away. Tanaka watched for a while, then asked Ren if the camera was running. Ren said it was. Tanaka nodded and did not say anything else. Tanaka established the protocols over the following days. The fence repaired a small controlled gate installed in the shared wall between the two enclosures, supervised morning sessions with both animals in the outdoor section on either side of the wire camera monitoring through the night. The sessions ran as they had from that first morning, Yuki on her side of the fence, Bunta on his close enough to smell each other, close enough for her to push her fingers through the wire mesh and reach the edge of his coat, but the fence between them. Mornings Bunta lay near the fence line in the thin November sun. Yuki ate her morning food on the concrete beside the wire. She carried enrichment items, a length of knotted rope, a section of hollow bamboo to the fence, and pushed them partway through the mesh, then retrieved them. She groomed the sections of his coat she could reach through the wire, and he submitted to it with the patience of an animal that has nowhere else to be. On the 11th day, Ishida noted a change in Bunta's weekly weight check. His food consumption had increased not dramatically, but measurably enough to affect the fat accumulation numbers in a way that her November projections had not included. She checked it again the following week and the week after. Tanuki are documented to be sensitive to social environment in ways that affect cortisol, which affects appetite, which affects the fat storage the species depends on to survive winter. Bunta had no partner of his own kind. He had a small macaque who groomed him each morning through a wire fence and sat beside him through the afternoon sessions, and something in that contact was shifting the numbers in the direction they needed to go. Ishida updated his file intake, improving fat accumulation within projected range for safe torpor. She did not add anything further. The macaque troop in those same weeks had begun to register that something about Yuki had changed. Not Bunta, the troop kept their distance from him, a wall of careful avoidance that did not break, but Yuki herself. She moved through the enclosure differently. She no longer positioned herself at the edges. She had stopped pressing her hand against the mesh in the mornings before the troop came out. A younger female named Kiri had begun appearing near Yuki during morning feeding. Close, not touching, not acknowledging. She appeared the next day and the day after. On the 4th day, she sat close enough to groom and did not. On the 5th day, she did. By the end of November, Kiri was arriving at Yuki's side each morning before the feeding station opened, settling within arm's reach, and the two of them sitting together through the first hour of the day, in the particular silence of animals that have reached an understanding without needing to negotiate it. One morning, near the end of November, a keeper finishing the pre-opening check on Bunta's enclosure left the controlled gate unlatched. It was not discovered until Ren arrived for the morning session 20 minutes later and found the gate standing open. Bunta was already through it. He was sitting in the outdoor section of the macaque enclosure 3 meters from where Yuki stood, watching him from beside the fence line, both of them motionless, the open gate behind him and nothing else between them. Ren did not close it. He stood at the enclosure entrance and watched. Bunta crossed the remaining distance. In the deliberate low-to-the-ground way, he moved through any unfamiliar space, stopping 2 body lengths from Yuki and settling onto the concrete. Yuki watched him for a long time. Then she walked over and began to groom him. Not through wire, not at an angle, just her hands moving through his coat the way she had been practicing for 3 weeks, and him sitting still beneath it in the open air of a cold November morning while the troop watched from a distance they did not close. Tanaka reviewed the gate log when he arrived and had a brief conversation with the keeper responsible. Then he watched the footage from the morning session without speaking for a while. That afternoon, he adjusted the protocol-supervised shared outdoor sessions, both animals in the same space gate managed deliberately from that morning forward. The fence between the 2 enclosures remained. The gate in it was now open every morning. December came in cold, and without much warning, the temperature dropping in the 2nd week to the point where the outdoor concrete held its chill through midday, and the camellia hedge at the edge of Bunta's enclosure dropped its last leaves in a single night. Bunta began to slow. His heart rate, which the monitoring equipment tracked, continuously dropped 8 beats per minute over 3 days. His body temperature declined a fraction of a degree each night. He ate in smaller portions and spent longer periods in the shallow state that precedes full torpor. Not quite asleep, not quite present, his responses to sound and movement arriving a beat later than they had before. Ishida reviewed Bunta's torpor trajectory at the first week of December and raised a concern with Tanaka, a tanuki entering deep torpor alone, without the body heat of a partner to regulate the process, ran a higher metabolic risk than one that had companionship through the night. The morning sessions gave Yuki access to Bunta through the day. They did not cover the hours that mattered most. Tanaka signed off on an extended access arrangement. Yuki would be transferred to Bunta's enclosure each evening before the keepers left, and returned to her crate in the macaque enclosure each morning before the troop came out. It was not standard protocol. It was the option they had. Yuki had been spending most of each day near Bunta since the gate accident, and she noticed the change in him before the monitoring equipment registered it. The specific warmth she had been pressing herself against through the long December evenings was different now. Less immediate, the breathing slower, the small shifts of position that had punctuated their time together growing rare. She began to stay closer, grooming for longer sitting pressed against his side through the afternoon instead of ranging through the space. On the coldest evenings, she tucked herself against the curve of his back and did not move until the night check keeper arrived. On the night of December 14th, the temperature dropped to -1. Bunta had reached the deepest torpor he had entered so far, breathing at roughly a third of his normal rate, unresponsive to the keeper's light. When the night check came through at midnight, his body temperature low enough that the monitoring system flagged it twice before the on-call staff confirmed it was within expected parameters for the stage of torpor he was in. Yuki sat beside him in the dark. She had been there since the evening transfer. At some point after 2 in the morning, she made a sound the contact call of a juvenile macaque, short and ascending the call that means, "I am here." She had been making this call into the enclosure air for months, with no response from the troop. Bunta's breathing changed. It took 40 seconds. Then he lifted his head from the ground and turned toward her with the slow, effortful focus of an animal pulling itself up from a long way down. He looked at her. Then he moved his body so that his flank, the densest and warmest section of his winter coat, was turned toward her and settled back. His breathing slowed again within 2 minutes. Yuki pressed herself against the new position and slept. Ren reviewed the footage the next morning. He watched the sequence 3 times. Then he sat for a while before continuing with the rest of the checks. The on-call keeper had logged the event in the overnight report, 0214 hours, contact vocalization. Subject responded repositioned. Ishida read the report and added a note to Bunta's file. She did not explain the note. January brought 4 nights below -3. Bunta moved through them in the deep, barely responsive state of full torpor, his reserves drawn down steadily toward the minimum the keepers had calculated as the threshold for safe emergence. Yuki stayed with him through the worst nights, grooming the parts of him that were accessible sleeping against his back. And when he surfaced partway in response to temperature shifts, being there in the same position she had been in when he went under. His reserves, when Ishida checked them at the end of January, were within range. Not by much. Within range. Kiri had begun grooming Yuki in the second week of December's short sessions. At first, then longer. By January, 2 other juveniles were eating within arm's reach of her during morning feeding. Nobody in the troop had made a decision about Yuki. There had been no moment of formal inclusion. There was simply less distance between her and the others than there had been before, and then less than that. And then one morning in late January, Ren arrived at the enclosure to find Yuki sitting in the middle of a grooming cluster, with Kiri on one side and one of the younger females on the other. The whole group shifting and resettling with the easy inattentiveness of animals who have forgotten that the arrangement was ever different. Bunta came out of torpor early in March. He moved slowly at first, testing his legs, standing for a moment and then settling back, standing again and holding it. His weight was down from his November numbers as expected. But within the range, Ishida had projected as survivable. His coat, which had thickened through the winter into something dense and muted, caught the early spring light differently than it had in December. He ate his morning meal in full. Then he moved to the section of fence nearest the macaque enclosure and lay down in the thin March sun, his masked face turned toward the mesh. On the other side, Yuki was sitting with Kiri. She looked up when he settled. Then she went back to what she was doing. The enclosure renovations were scheduled for April. The macaque habitat needed structural work. The tanuki enclosure needed the fence replacement that had been deferred since the previous spring. The plan that emerged from the planning meetings separated the two enclosures properly and permanently, with one addition along a shared wall, a section of safety glass floor to ceiling, wide enough for an animal on either side to see clearly into the other space. The Prefectural Wildlife Authority asked whether this was operationally necessary. Tanaka said it was not, and that they were doing it anyway. The move happened on a Tuesday in late April. The camellia was in full bloom, the pink flowers dropping onto the concrete of Bunta's old enclosure in the drifts they made every spring. The troop went through first, moving through the transfer tunnel with the noise a macaque troop makes when it is collectively uncertain. Yuki went with them, not at the front, not at the back, somewhere in the middle of the group, moving when they moved, pausing when they paused. Bunta was moved an hour later in a transport crate released into the new enclosure and spent 20 minutes tracing its perimeter before settling near the glass wall. The troop took time to work through the new space, investigating the structures, establishing the warm spots, sorting out the morning hierarchy in the new configuration. Yuki moved through it with them. She was not leading anything. She was not notable in any particular way. She was part of the group, which was what she was now. She came to the glass on her own. Bunta was already on the other side, lying close to it, with his face turned toward the macaque enclosure. Yuki stopped at the glass and put her hand against it. Bunta looked at the hand. He looked at it for a while. Then he set his chin on his paws and closed his eyes. In the spring report filed for the Prefectural Wildlife Authority, Dr. Ishida recorded that Bunta had completed his second winter within normal health parameters and showed no signs of the metabolic decline documented the previous year. She recorded that Yuki had achieved full troop integration and was demonstrating age-appropriate social behaviors. She noted that the mechanism by which the interspecies contact had produced these outcomes remained incompletely understood. Ren completed his first year at Inokashira on a Thursday in May. He spent the following morning on the keeper walkway outside the macaque enclosure, going through the season's observation records. Intake figures, weight benchmarks, the documented week-by-week progression of the reintroduction from the day. Yuki's crate went into the enclosure to the morning he had found her sleeping against the mesh, with her hand against the wire. At the end of the last page, he added a single line. Both animals are doing well. Then he closed the folder, set it on the shelf beside the door, and went to start the morning checks. On most mornings now, if you stand at the glass wall between the two enclosures, you will find Bunta already there, on his side, lying close to the glass, in the spot that catches the first of the morning sun. Chin on paws, his masked face turned toward the macaque habitat. On the other side of the glass, the troop moves through its morning routine. Somewhere in the middle of it, Yuki moves with them. She does not always come to the glass. When she does, she puts her hand against it for a moment, and then she goes back to the troop. Bunta watches her go. Then he closes his eyes and rests in the sun because it is spring and the winter is behind him and the morning is warm.